So in our previous learning objective, we looked at quadrant 1 of the unit circle, and we had to memorize a bunch of stuff, these different angles and their points on the unit circle. And now we're going to look at the full unit circle. All right, so we're going from 1 quadrant to 4, all right, but it's not 4 times as much work, and let's see why. All right, so our goal is basically to fill in this entire unit circle. All right, we're going to have all these angles and all these points. So it seems like a lot of work, but if you have the previous learning objective mastered, it's not 4 times as much work. So the first thing we're going to do is the first thing that we learned in our previous learning objective was the 4 quadrantal angles. All right, so I'm just going to kind of click through these, and then we're going to do it all together at the end. All right, so now we have the 4 quadrantal angles. All right, those are the ones we've been dealing with the most this unit. And because you're just going in a straight direction, you just get 1s for the values. All right, then the next thing we have is our quadrant 1 values. We learned those by looking at these special right triangles. I remember there was some pattern to the x values getting bigger and the y values getting, the y values getting bigger and the x values getting smaller, that type of thing. But this is what we learned in the last learning objective along with their angles. All right, so now we have kind of all of quadrant 1 filled in. So after I have these angles, the other angles in the circle are going to follow a similar pattern. We'll talk about this pattern when we do it together, but let's just see what it's going to look like. It's going to look like that. All right, so just a quick hint of the patterns is the over 3s kind of all go in the same place. The over 4s all kind of go in the same place in the middle there. And the over 6s all kind of go in the same place. All right, so there's a pattern to the angles that give me the rest of the angles in the unit circle. And next is talking about the values. All right, so the values, again, when it goes up on the screen all at once like that, it's really kind of scary. All right, but if you look at the values around, they all use these same values over and over again. The only difference is sometimes they're negative. All right, so they're all the same numbers. It's just sometimes they're negative. So it's not a bunch of extra stuff you have to memorize. You got to recognize the relationships between what you have and what you want. And then finally, we just add in the degrees. This is probably something that you would actually do earlier. That's kind of get us the full unit circle now that we have all the angles in radians and degrees and all the points. All right, so now this slide is going to be the long one because we're going to do all of this by hand to show how you can do it on your skill check. Again, just like your last learning objective, this learning objective is literally going to be, I'm going to hand you this blank sheet and you have to fill in all these blanks. All right, so let's start off basically the same way that we did in our previous learning objective. All right, we're going to look at the quadrant or the quadrantal angles first. So this is 0 and 2 pi. Oh, sorry, 0 and it's in degrees, so it should be 180. Oh my goodness. I keep messing up. That's not 180 either. It's 360. There we go. Because 180 is over here, 90 is up here, and 270 is there. All right, in radians, 0 radians or 2 pi are the same. This is pi over 2, pi, and 3 pi over 2. So these ones you've been working with a little bit longer, along with their points. This is the point 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. All right, so those are the quadrantal angles, are the ones we've been working with the longest since like the second learning objective of this unit. All right, now we can fill in the stuff that we learned from the previous learning objective. So the angles in quadrant 1 are 30, 45, 60. In radians, they're pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3. And then the points, all right, the y values get bigger. So I start at 0, the next one's 1/2, next one's square root of 2 over 2, next one's square root of 3 over 2. The x values get smaller, so I start at 1 and then go to the square root of 3 over 2, square root of 2 over 2, and then 1/2. All right, so that's all stuff you did in the previous learning objective. All right, now let's talk about how we can fill in the other quadrants. So for the rest of the circle in degrees, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it, but one kind of way I remember is that the big gaps are a 30-degree gap, and the small gaps are 15-degree gaps. So if I have 90 already written, I have a big gap to the next angle, which is 30, means that that's going to be 120. I have a small gap, so I add 15, that's going to be 135. Another small gap, I add 15, that's 150. A big gap, I add 30, and that gets me back to 180. All right, so the big gaps are 30 degrees, small gaps are 15, means this is 210. This is 225. This is 240. Add 30 gets me to 270. 270 plus 30, that means this is 300. Plus 15, plus 15, plus 30. All right, so that's the way I can get the rest of the circle in degrees by just following the same pattern as quadrant 1. What about in radians? Well, if you can do it in degrees, you could just convert all these to radians, but again, that's going to take forever. Like we looked at the slide, this one's going to be something over 3. This one's going to be something over 4, over 6, be something over 6, over 4, over 3, over 3, over 4, over 6. Again, there's a pattern to all these things, so if you recognize the pattern. And then what is the pattern going to be? In quadrant 2, it's the bottom minus 1. So this is 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 6. All right, so it's the bottom minus 1. In quadrant 3, it's the bottom plus 1, so it's going to be 7 pi over 6. 4 plus 1 is 5 pi over 4. 3 plus 1 is 4 pi over 3. All right, so just recognizing the patterns of what's happening in each quadrant. And then quadrant 4, similar to quadrant 2, except for instead of the bottom minus 1, it's twice the bottom minus 1. So 3 times 2 is 6. 6 minus 1 is 5. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 minus 1 is 7. 12 minus 1 is 11. All right, so that's the way I remember those ones as well. There's a bunch of other ways, and when you've been doing, this stuff for so many years, there's other ways you can remember, but this is kind of a good first way to remember all the angles in the unit circle. And now the last thing is the values. All right, so now the values we saw before, they're all going to be the same, so I can kind of just copy all these down. This will take me a little bit of time. Actually, let me just pause the video. I'm going to basically just copy them all down, again, using the same pattern as quadrant 1. All right, so it's going to look something like this. This is not the final answer yet, but you can see every time I see an over 3, it's 1/2 comma square root of 3 over 2. So there's 4 of those. Every single time there's an over 4, they're both the square root of 2 over 2. Every time there's an over 6, it's a square root of 3 over 2, 1/2. All right, so that lets me copy down all these values really quickly. And then the only thing that's different is in different quadrants, some x values are positive and some y values are positive. So in quadrant 1, x and y are positive. In quadrant 2, I'm going to the left now, so x is no longer positive, only y is positive. Quadrant 3, none of them are positive, they're both negative. And in quadrant 1, I'm going to the right, so x is positive, but I'm going down, so y is negative. So as I go around now, in quadrant 2, the x value should be negative, so I'm going to put an extra negative sign in front of all the x values. Quadrant 3, they both should be negative, so I'm going to put an extra negative sign in front of everything. And in quadrant 4, only the y value should be negative. So I'm just putting an extra negative sign on the right-hand ones. All right, so it's all patterns related to the first quadrant. So if you can remember this part, which was what you had to do in the last learning objective, so you should be able to do that first quadrant. You can get the other stuff by just following patterns. So for degrees, remembering the 15 and 30 degree gaps, that'll get you the rest of what's in black, those degrees. For the radians, remembering that the denominators are the same when they're in kind of the same location. And then in quadrant 2, you take the bottom minus 1 to get that extra number. Quadrant 3, you take the bottom plus 1 to get that number. And in quadrant 4, it's twice the bottom minus 1. All right, so that can get you all the stuff in red. And then get all the stuff in blue. Remember, the numbers are the same, so every single time I see an over 3, I'm going to write the same numbers. And just remembering the pattern of, in the quadrant 2, x is negative. Quadrant 3, x and y are negative. Quadrant 4, just y is negative. So it looks like a lot, and it is a lot, but you're not actually memorizing all, 60 of these blanks or however many blanks there are. You're just memorizing one quadrant and using that pattern to fill in the rest. So your skill check is going to be that blank unit circle. You're going to have to do without notes. All right, so you basically just have to do exactly what I did on that previous slide of going through and filling everything in.